Okay, so far we've become familiar with Bentham's principle of utility, and I've said a little bit about how to apply it in a particular case by giving you an example, kind of a funny example of me trying to decide whether or not to send out chocolate samples to all the students in 242. Where Bentham goes now in his text is kind of amazing. He claims to have an account, a kind of system for estimating or measuring the total pleasure generated by any action. And so what he describes is a kind of science of pleasure and pain, a kind of description of all of the dimensions of pleasure and pain. And we'll see how that works in just a moment. So the first of these dimensions is the intensity of the pleasure, right? So some pleasures are more intense than others, and all else being equal, a more intense pleasure is better than a less intense one because it's, in a way, more pleasurable, you could say. There's more pleasure in it. It has a higher positive utility, okay? Second is the duration of a pleasure. So the longer a pleasure lasts, the better it is, right? It's more pleasure overall. So longer lasting pleasures have a higher utility as well. A third dimension is whether the pleasure is certain or uncertain to arise from the action considered. So here the question is whether, given some action that's being estimated in terms of its total utility or the total utility that it will generate, we have to ask whether the pleasures that result from it will certainly result from it or might result from it and might not. What's the probability that this action will generate high pleasure? And then the fourth dimension is something that Bentham calls propinquity or remoteness, which basically just means how soon will the pleasure manifest? How soon will the pleasure be experienced? And all else being equal, more propinquitous pleasures are better, have higher utility, and are preferable to more remote pleasures, because the more propinquitous pleasures are able to be enjoyed more quickly, and that's a better thing. So these are the first four dimensions of pleasure. Bentham is going to add another three that are going to be important to consider when we're evaluating the total utility generated by some action. But I want to mention now that these can apply. Remember, utility is a kind of spectrum that includes both pleasure and pain. So there's both positive utility and negative utility. And so these dimensions apply to negative utility as well, that is to pain. If you think about it, we can ask about any given pain, how intense is the pain? How long does it last? How certain or uncertain is it that a given action will generate pain of that kind, or will generate pain as a result? And how close in time or far away in time is the pain that will be generated by a given action? So moving on to consider these other dimensions, the fifth and sixth are something that Bentham calls fecundity and purity. So the fecundity of a pleasure or of an action that generates a pleasure has to do with, or it's a measure of, how many more pleasures will result from that initial action. So sometimes one action sets us up. It might be pleasurable in itself or might not be pleasurable in itself, but sometimes it sets us up for further pleasures down the line, and actions like that are more fecund. Okay, so the action may not itself generate a pleasure of long duration, but the action sets us up for being in a place so that some other thing can happen or some other action can be taken, or even a series of actions or a set of actions and situations that will be themselves pleasurable. So actions like that are more fecund. And the purity of a pleasure measures how likely it is to not be followed by pains. Okay, so some pleasures, they're particularly impure. Think, for instance, the pleasure associated with heroin. the drug heroin. So, okay, maybe it's very high in intensity and somewhat high in duration, but it's a very impure pleasure because usually consuming heroin leads to pretty significant pain at some point in the future because of addiction and withdrawal and the other pains associated with addiction and the physical effects of the drug on the body. So heroin use would be an example of a particularly high intensity, high duration pleasure or pleasurable action, but also one that has a particularly high impurity because it's usually followed by significant pain. And then finally, the last dimension of pleasure is what Bentham calls the extent. And this is basically the number of persons who experience pleasure from the act, okay, or for whom the act generates pleasure. Now, to calculate the extent, one has to, in a way, consider all of dimensions 1 through 6 for each of the people that are affected. So it's the same principle of determining the interests of the community as a whole by adding up the interests of each of the individual members. And again, how do we find out what are the interests of each of the individual members? We have to find out what's the total positive utility and negative utility for each member. And we find out the total positive and negative utility by applying dimensions 1 through 6 here. So dimension 7 is capturing that community component. It's asking about whether the act generates pleasure or pain, for how many people the act generates pleasure and pain, of what intensity, duration, propinquity, and so on. And so here's the list of the 7 dimensions of pleasure that Bentham lays out. Okay, what I would like to do now, and this will wrap up this video lecture, is just talk through from the beginning the total process of using the principle of utility and these 7 dimensions of pleasure to estimate the total utility of any proposed action. And Bentham himself describes this procedure at the end of the reading that was assigned from him for this week. And I should note as well that in your reading responses for this week, I've asked you to apply these 7 dimensions of pleasure to a particular example and make a decision about which of the options presented does the best job of maximizing utility. That is, which one best promotes utility, best promotes positive utility and not negative utility. So on we go to Bentham's summary at the end of the text. He says in a section that's titled Process of Estimating the Tendency of Any Act or Event. To take an exact account then of the general tendency of any act by which the interests of a community are affected, proceed as follows. So this is basically him telling us how to estimate, how to determine whether or not an act favors the interests of a community, whether or not it promotes the interests of a community, whether or not it meets the principle of utility. He says, begin with any one person of those whose interests seem most immediately to be affected by it, and take account of the value of each distinguishable pleasure which appears to be produced by it in the first instance. That is, with the pleasures that appear to be produced by it right away for that person. And so I've listed those here as plus 5u, plus 6u. I'm just using u as a unit of utility. Then take account, too, of the value of each pain which appears to be produced by it in the first instance. And I've represented these here as the negative u's, the negative u numbers. So these are each individual pains that will be experienced by this individual if this action is taken. Of the value then, we need to take account of the value of each pleasure which appears to be produced by it after the first. This constitutes the fecundity of the first pleasure and the impurity of the first pain. So this is our estimate of fecundity and purity, basically. And likewise, we take account of the value of each pain which appears to be produced by it after the first. This constitutes the fecundity of the first pain and the impurity of the first pleasure. Then sum up all the values of all the pleasures on the one side and those of all the pains on the other. The balance, if it be on the side of pleasure, will give the good tendency of the act upon the whole with respect to the interests of that individual person. If on the side of pain, the bad tendency of it upon the whole. And so that's what I have here, that adding up all of the utility, all of the positive utility events here, and all of the negative utility events that result from this individual action. So I'm adding up all those values, and that gives me an 18 positive utility and a 9 negative utility in this imagined case. And finally, in step 6 here, take an account of the number of persons whose interests appear to be concerned and repeat the above process with respect to each. Sum up the numbers expressive of the degrees of good tendency which the act has with respect to each individual in regard to whom the tendency of it is good upon the whole. Do this again with respect to each individual in regard to whom the tendency of it is bad upon the whole. So he's saying on one side, add up all the positive utilities for those individuals who have a net positive utility, just for that individual, okay? And then do the same thing for all of the individuals who have a net negative utility. Take the balance, which if on the side of pleasure will give the general good tendency of the act with respect to the total number of community of individuals concerned, if on the side of pain, the general evil tendency with respect to the same community. So in other words, we just sum up the total positive utilities and the total negative utilities for each of the individuals in our analysis, and that gives us the total utility for the community. And if it's positive, then that tells us that the action would have some positive benefit for the community. And the number gives us an estimate of that, what that total positive benefit is. And if it's negative, then it tells us what the total harm to the community will be. And the number gives us, again, some measure of the magnitude of that harm. Okay, well, that wraps up my coverage of Bentham's general ethical theory. And what I'll do in the last video lectures for this sequence on Bentham is we'll return to those issues that I mentioned at the start: punishment and the treatment of animals, and women's rights, and so on. And we'll see what Bentham had to say about those things. So what you might do at this point before you go on to watch the fourth video is ask yourself, what do I think Bentham would have said about those things? Okay, and then in the fourth video, I'll talk through what he did say about them.